first, everything feels normal. Too normal. You're standing in a place that was designed for people to be there. Maybe it's your apartment building, quiet except for the hum of electricity. Maybe it's a narrow street buzzing with music and laughter. Maybe it's a public event, packed but familiar, the kind of crowd you've been in 100 times before. Nothing feels reckless. Nothing feels unsafe. And that's the point. These are world-class cities. This is supposed to be the safest version of modern life. Then something shifts. In Hong Kong's Tai Po district, it started with smoke moving faster than anyone expected. Residents didn't panic at first. Fires happen. Buildings have codes. Fire services exist. But this one climbed. It wrapped itself around the building, feeding on materials that were never supposed to burn that way. Later, investigators would talk about renovation scaffolding, plastic sheeting, cheaper substitutes mixed in with approved materials. Residents had complained long before the fire. Warnings had been raised. Inspections had been passed anyway. When people died, the building didn't behave unpredictably. It behaved exactly as experts had warned it would. Afterward, the familiar script kicked in. Arrests, investigations, statements about isolated wrongdoing. The focus narrowed quickly to a few individuals, a few contractors, a few decisions taken out of context. What never fully surfaced was the larger question: how did a world-class city allow a residential building to become a vertical fuse? In Seoul, on Halloween night in Itaewon, the danger wasn't hidden behind walls or materials. It was visible, audible, and unfolding in real time. A narrow, sloping street filled beyond capacity. People called emergency services hours before anyone died, saying the crowd was getting dangerous, that people were being pushed, that something felt wrong. No major intervention came. There was no crowd control, no barriers, no rerouting. When bodies began compressing, panic didn't cause the deaths. Space did. Physics did. Human bodies pressed together with nowhere to go. In the days after, the language mattered more than it should have. It was called a stampede. That word did a lot of work. A stampede implies chaos, irrationality, people losing control. But crowd scientists were clear. This wasn't a stampede. It was a crush. The space failed. Planning failed. Authority failed. Yet despite public apologies and promises of reform, no senior official truly absorbed responsibility. Grief stayed with families. Accountability stayed abstract. London's Grenfell Tower tells a slower, more disturbing version of the same story. A high-rise in one of the richest cities in the world, wrapped in cladding chosen, not because it was safest, but because it was cheaper and looked better. Residents had raised concerns for years. Fire experts had warned about combustible materials. Regulations existed, but enforcement had been weakened over decades. When the fire started, it moved upward as if the building itself was helping it along. 72 people died, many trapped in their own homes. Years later, official inquiries would confirm what survivors already knew. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of deregulation, misleading claims by manufacturers, failures by architects, and a system that prioritized appearance and cost over human life. And still, justice has been slow, fragmented, diluted. The system investigated itself carefully. None of these places lacked rules. In fact, they were saturated with them. Building codes, safety regulations, permits, protocols. On paper, everything looked responsible. These were not unregulated environments. They were over-documented ones. But somewhere along the way, regulation stopped being about prevention and started being about protection. Not protection of people, but protection of institutions. This is what regulatory theater looks like. Rules exist to show that rules exist. Inspections happen to demonstrate oversight, not to uncover inconvenient truths. Compliance becomes a technical state, not a moral one. If something goes wrong, there's paperwork ready to prove that procedure was followed, even if common sense was not. Before every one of these disasters, there were warnings. Residents complaining about blocked exits, tenants reporting unsafe renovations, emergency calls describing overcrowding, internal memos noting risks that needed further review. And then the same quiet decision was made again and again. Not now, Not yet. Let's revisit this later. Because acting would have meant friction. It would have meant delaying construction, limiting capacity, canceling events, angering developers, upsetting voters, slowing growth. In world-class cities, speed is rewarded, expansion is celebrated, safety is tolerated only when it doesn't interfere. When the disaster actually unfolds, the system doesn't collapse, it hesitates. Authority is fragmented. Agencies wait for clarity, frontline workers improvise. Everyone is careful, because taking initiative creates liability. By the time responsibility becomes clear, the moment for prevention is gone. Then comes the aftermath choreography. Leaders express shock. Investigations are announced. Task forces are formed. Language softens. Fires become incidents. Crushes become stampedes. Systemic failure becomes unfortunate oversight. Words matter because they shape blame. A stampede sounds like human error. An incident sounds unavoidable. Structural failure sounds damning. Blame rarely travels upward cleanly, it drips downward. A contractor, a junior inspector, a frontline officer, a resident. Someone small enough to absorb consequences without threatening the system. Meanwhile, the incentives that made the disaster likely remain untouched. World-class cities love density when it's profitable. More people per square meter means higher rents, higher returns, more activity. But density has limits that no amount of technology can erase. Human bodies need space. Smoke behaves the way it always has. Panic spreads faster than instructions. You can't negotiate with physics. You can only respect it or ignore it. What makes this harder to confront is distance. The people approving these decisions rarely live with the consequences. They don't occupy subdivided apartments. They don't rely on aging infrastructure maintained by the lowest bidder. They don't stand in unmanaged crowds without controlled exits. Risk flows downward. Safety narratives flow upward. Speed makes everything worse. Projects are approved quickly. Renovations happen under pressure. Events are greenlit because canceling them would be politically or financially painful. Leaders operate on election cycles, not safety cycles. Saying no feels like failure. Saying yes feels like progress. So cities invest in symbolic fixes instead. New committees, new reporting requirements, new technologies layered over old problems, cameras instead of crowd limits, apps instead of exits, dashboards instead of enforcement. These solutions look impressive. They photograph well, they signal action, but they don't change incentives. What's unsettling is that none of this is secret. After every major disaster, independent experts explain exactly what went wrong and how easily it could have been prevented. The same recommendations surface again and again. Stronger enforcement, independent oversight, clear accountability, real consequences. And yet, years later, similar tragedies happen elsewhere, under slightly different circumstances. Because meaningful reform threatens the growth model. It slows things down, raises costs, limits capacity, forces transparency. And transparency is dangerous when success depends on maintaining the appearance of control. There's also a quiet agreement we rarely talk about. Living in a world-class city comes with an unspoken promise of competence. Believing in that promise makes daily risk feel manageable. Questioning it feels destabilizing. So residents, institutions, and leaders participate in the same illusion. We trust the system, and the system avoids forcing us to confront how fragile it really is. When the headlines fade, families keep asking questions. Journalists keep digging. Legal processes stretch on. Attention moves elsewhere. The system waits people out. It usually wins. This isn't about incompetence. These cities are extremely competent at what they prioritize. They are good at attracting capital, good at branding, good at managing perception. They are far less capable of absorbing responsibility when responsibility collides with power and profit. Failure in these cases isn't a breakdown, it's a byproduct. So when a city calls itself world-class, that label deserves scrutiny, not for how impressive it looks, not for how fast it grows, but for how it behaves when something goes wrong. Who is protected, who is exposed, and who is expected to quietly carry the cost. Because if these disasters have taught us anything, it's that the people who suffer most are almost never the ones who made the decisions.